Hello, welcome back to A to Z Explain. This is AP Biology, Unit 1, Topic 3, Biochemistry, Molecular Diversity, Carbon, and Functional Groups. So first, we have the concept of organic chemistry, which refers to the chemistry in the context of the element. You may have guessed it from down here. This is carbon. And carbon is a really important element for all of life as we know it, for a couple reasons. So, the first key takeaway of this video is that carbon is the basis for all life because of three reasons. The first of which is that carbon is straight up just really common, like it's found all over Earth, and there's a pretty wide abundance of carbon on Earth, which makes it convenient for life because you need a lot of stuff to support a lot of life. The next reason why carbon is the basis for life is that carbon makes blank bonds. And I drew a little diagram to help visualize how many bonds this makes. As we learned from our previous video, the context of chemistry, go watch that if you're unfamiliar with what I'm about to tell you, because I think it clears it up. But in general, elements want to fill their electron shells. On the second shell, they want to fill their valence electron shells with eight electrons. So as you see from the inside, carbon is a 6-proton molecule, and carbon wants to fill its electrons. It's a valence electron shell, and because it can fill it with 8, that means it has 4 electrons by default on the outside, plus the 2 on the inside, so that the 6 protons and 6 electrons are matching. But then it also wants to make 1, 2, 3, 4 extra bonds with 4 extra electrons so that it can fill its shell. So from that, we can see how carbon wants to make 4 bonds. The next reason, I partly filled it in, but carbon is good at sharing electrons. Let me finish writing that in. It's good at finishing electrons. Right here, I started to draw a little scale of what's called electron negativity. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but it's basically the concept of how good or bad is a specific element at sharing electrons, dependent on factors like its valence electron shells and stuff like that. In this case, carbon, on this spectrum, these other 4 elements are the 4 other common elements in life, or super common elements in life, and we'll go over them more deeply. But carbon is around right here, if I had to put it on the spectrum, at around a 2.5 on for simplicity's sake, I'll call it like a 0 to 4 scale. But it's slightly dependent. It's not exactly. That's a very generous approximation. And 2.4, I meant 2.5. Around there. For context, hydrogen is about like a 2.1. Oxygen is like over here, like a 3.5 or something like that. Around there. I have to check a table. But in general, this means because carbon is in the middle of all these elements, it is pretty good at sharing electrons relative to the other elements that are commonly in life. And that brings me to talking about not just carbon, although carbon is so important, but the other 4 elements, the first of which is hydrogen. And these are the building blocks of life because they are super common as well, and they are great for making certain molecules that are really important for life. So what I want to talk about is the bonding of all of these, which is very important because bonding makes molecules and molecules makes life. Hydrogen is the first one. And this, if we want to visualize it, I did not draw the neutrons in the diagram, only these red protons for simplicity's sake. But hydrogen has 1 electron in its outer valence shell because of it has 1 proton, but it wants to fill that shell with 1 extra proton so that it can fill the valence shell, as we know from previous videos. So hydrogen wants to make 1 bond. If we move down to, and I'm going to go quicker now because I've explained this concept multiple times now, but oxygen, it wants to make 2 bonds, as we can see here, to fill its shell. Over here, nitrogen wants to make 3 over here to fill its shell. Carbon, as we talked about, wants to make 4. And then over here, phosphorus. Phosphorus is complicated, so I didn't draw it out, and it has like a different reason as to why it makes extra bonds despite its valence shell. It's a whole chemistry thing, but essentially what you need to know is phosphorus makes 5 bonds. And how I like to summarize it is right here, and how I've been taught to summarize it as honk P, which stands for the amount of bonds. As you can see, let me get the pointer out. Hydrogen likes to make 1 bond, oxygen likes to make 2 bonds, nitrogen 3, carbon 4, phosphorus 5. So that's just a way of remembering in order 1 through 5 how many bonds each element likes to make. And now I'd like to bring us to the basics of OChem. OChem as in organic chemistry, the study of carbon. This is just the basic notation. I'm not diving in at all to what anything related to OChem, really. This is just the basic notation that might show up in your course, and I will use it in future videos, so it's good to know. The first thing is these hexagon structures, and these come up a lot. Here's a pentagon structure, zigzag. But anyways, what this essentially means, if I wanted to draw it out, is here. I'll go back to these the pentagon and hexagon. I'm going to use this for simplicity. What this means is at every corner where multiple lines intersect, or at the end of a line, is a carbon. So this would represent this structure in terms of carbon. The lines represent carbon because it's organic chemistry, organic referring to carbon. So right here we can see the 4 carbon structure that this would make, as we see at each of the ends. And the lines represent the bonds. You could have a structure like this, even though that doesn't fit the valence rules at all. Theoretically, just hypothetically, just for the sake of explaining, that would be like a carbon, double bond carbon, carbon. But essentially, the other thing that this means is anytime there isn't anything special written on here, it's assumed that it's just as many carbons that can reasonably attach to make 4 bonds to that carbon. So in the form of hydrogens. So essentially what this is really meaning is we have our carbon structure, but each carbon wants to make 4 bonds. So this will have, because it has 1 bond already, this needs 3 more bonds of hydrogen. This one will need 1 on 2 hydrogens because it's already making 2 bonds. This one also will need 2, and then this one will need 3. So there we go. So this is the realized form of this right here. And that's essentially what you need to know about the notation for OChem. The next topic that we need to discuss is very important. It's functional groups. Functional groups are essentially extra groups of elements that are added on to many molecules, and they are very important for function in many different organic compounds and many different compounds that are relevant to life. The first group that you need to know is a hydroxyl group, which is essentially a bond of what we could call variable R group. When you see R, all that means is it's variable. It represents some other thing, but we're not worrying about that because we're worried about explaining what we do see right here, which is the OH. So this just means that there's something off over here bonded to an oxygen, which is bonded to an H, hydrogen. And And this is really important. And functional groups in general are really important because they add to structure and they add to interactions. Like hydroxyl groups are very common in many, many compounds because they allow for interactions between other molecules. Because in general, if you think about um, an O an OH, they're in general an OH group is negative, but then when you bind the OH to something, now it's satisfied because this oxygen right here is having its two bonds, which it likes if you remember honk P, and then the hydrogen is also bonded to it, which it likes because it makes its one bond. This is ethanol, which is a form of alcohol, and it's a very common molecule that you see. And right here, the important part is it's an example of a hydroxyl group, as we can see right there. This is the hydroxyl group. And that's just an example. The next group that you will need to know, and these, I'm not explaining exactly what they do here, but you'll see them throughout the rest of this course. Many examples of these functional groups. The next one is a carboxyl group, which this is how it may be notated if someone were to write it out just in terms of letters. A COOH, and this is right here is what it looks like. We have our variable R group, which is attached to a carbon, which is double bonded to an oxygen, and then also this carbon is also bonded to an OH group, a hydroxyl group. But because we add this carbon and an extra O, we call it a carboxyl group. And this is also what it looks like right here using our OChem notation, if you want to think about it that way. Right here is an amino group. This is the third one that you absolutely need to know. We have our R group, which is bonded to a nitrogen, which is bonded to a hydrogen and a hydrogen. And if you haven't noticed by now, all of these functional groups are constructed in a way so that each atom gets its desired amount of bonds. As you remember from honk P, nitrogen wants 3 bonds, and it gets that, and each hydrogen wants 1 bond. And then finally, we have a phosphate group, this is how it works. I'm going to erase this for 1 sec so that we can see this OH negative. But this is essentially a phosphorus, which is double bonded to an O, which is bonded to an OH on one side and an OH on another, and then an O minus. And because this is an O minus, it wants to make another bond because it only has 1 bond. So what ends up happening is that this O will end up making a bond to some variable R group, and this is how it attaches. Oftentimes, you'll also see some of these OH groups on the side with the hydrogen detached, and then they also make bonds with other stuff. So in general, that's how that works. And that's it for the very essential functional groups. There's a lot more, but those are the ones that you absolutely need to know and commit to memory. The next thing and the last thing in this video are the concept of dehydration and hydrolysis, which are both types of reactions. Dehydrolysis is the process of combining two things. Here, I'm going to draw a simplified diagram. We have thing 1 and thing 2. And dehydration is the process of combining the two, which ends up as a product releasing water. And I will show you exactly how it does this. These are just an example of a carboxyl group and an amino group, as you saw before. And if these were to have a dehydration reaction, what would happen is they would get a little bit closer first off. But I'm going to copy this just for demonstration purposes. What would essentially happen is the OH, through enzymes, the OH off the carboxyl on one end would be pulled off, and as well as the hydrogen from the other. And as you can see right here, we have an O, an H, and an H, which, funny enough, is the chemical formula for water. So this becomes H2O. And this is where we get the dehydrate because it's taking out a water. And then these two will end up combining as one because they want to form their bonds. So these will end up combining to form a new compound that's combined, and we get the release of water. So just to recap, as we saw above, thing 1 gets combined with thing 2. Thing 1 combined with thing 2, and then we get the release of water as well. And that's where the name dehydration comes from. And finally, the opposite of dehydration is hydrolysis, which is, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Right here, this is relatively unimportant, but this is just with bigger molecules, another example of what would happen with dehydration. Right here are 2 glucose molecules, and if these were to undergo dehydration, what we would see is one OH group would get pulled out, and one H group would get pulled out from the other. And what would happen is this O would then be shared. Here, let me get this going. This partial. This O would be attached to both, and they'd both be bonded using the O as like a bridge almost. And what we'd get is another OHH, which is H2O, and we get the release of water. Back to hydrolysis, which is the undoing of these reactions. And what this is taking your combined new molecule and returning it to 2 separate molecules through the addition of water rather than the release of water. And how this goes down is we'll have our 2 things. An enzyme will come in and it will add water to right here, which results in these being separated. And the OH from the water will go onto one end, and the H will go into the other, forming 2 separate molecules again. And that's about it. Was not pretty. But anyways, there you have it. If you want to take a screenshot at any point, here it is. Here is first page, second page, third page. Not very pretty, but rewatch if you would like to. Anyways, that's it for AP Bio Topic 3.